delighted to have two old friends of Ole Miss and the Overby Center back with us tonight. To my immediate left, we have Gene Dattel. Gene's a native of Rubel and is the author of a new book, Reckoning with Race, America's Failure. And though Gene's professional work has been in the area of international finance in New York, where he now lives, he really hasn't forgotten his roots, and he's become a recognized authority on the subject of race. He was here for a program with us last when he talked about a previous book, Cotton and Race in the Making of America. Gene, good to have you back. And just over there is another old friend, Otis Sanford, who grew up near Como, graduated from Ole Miss in 1975 with a journalism degree and went into a long career in newspapers, culminating with his role as managing editor of the Commercial Appeal. A few years ago, Otis joined the journalism faculty at the University of Memphis, but he still writes a Sunday column for the Commercial Appeal, and he is the author, most recently, of his book, From Boss Crump to King Willie, How Race Changed Memphis Politics. We're real fortunate to have both these two gentlemen here together this time for exploration of what Gunnar Myrdal described in his epic study, and it's a very massive book in 1944 called An American Dilemma. So I turn it over to you gentlemen. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gene?
It's good to be here again. My first trip to Ole Miss was in 1954 to watch a football game, obviously. Otis and I come from the private sector. We've had lots of conversations. So you have the journalist and my career in the financial world, and as well as a historian. And we thought that we would give you a little bit of our parallel lives before we got into the subject matter.
Those are our books, obviously. Let me also say that I'm really happy to be back on the campus. I'm here quite often, and that's one of the places that I really love. Graduated from here, and really happy to see a lot of old friends, certainly my hero, Dr. Kayat. It's great to see you. Yeah, we really like Dr. Kayat. That picture on your left is my childhood home in Como, Mississippi, on a farm that my mother and father owned. We were not sharecroppers, but we were croppers. I lived in that house until I came to Ole Miss. And then once I left Ole Miss, I moved to Jackson, Mississippi, and I never really lived in that house again. But that was the center of my life for the first 20 years of my life. It's where my 6 older brothers and sisters, where we lived, where we worked, where we tilled the fields, where we milked the cows, where we did everything that you would do on a farm in a very segregated society in the 1950s and 60s in Panola County, Mississippi. But it was a place that I cherished just because it was a comforting place, and it's where I learned how to write. It's where I learned and got my first education, and it's just so near and dear to me that and it's not in the family anymore, but it's still near and dear to me as the place that I call home.
The home on the right, which is a small version of my grandfather's home. He was the Jewish immigrant from Eastern Europe who settled, of all places, in Sunflower, Mississippi, town of 500 people. And that home is very important to me. It sloped down to the Sunflower River, and I would go down there as a kid and watch black baptisms across the Sunflower River. And that was a racial chasm, but I can remember it vividly. We moved from Sunflower to Ruleville when my older brother kept climbing out of the one-room schoolhouse at 1 o'clock in the afternoon to come home. That one-room schoolhouse housed 6 grades. So we moved 10 miles away for the education, Ruleville town of 1,500 people. This home has some significance for Mississippi and for journalism because that's the home in which Craig Claiborne was born. And he was the man who democratized food and was the writer for the New York Times. This is the quintessential Jewish occupation. My family had stores, and this was the store opening in Ruleville, Mississippi in 1951. And the family, it was a family affair. The man on the left there was my great uncle, another immigrant, and the man on his right is my father, and the man at the cash register is my uncle, who was the mayor of Rosedale, Mississippi, and was continually reelected after blacks were re-enfranchised in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The woman with her back to you is my mother. So this was a family event. As you can see, there are a lot of strong, secure male role models there. The department store, these were dry goods. I don't know why it was called dry goods. Dry goods stores were, in those size towns, they were the center, they were integrated fully. And although it's not distinct, you can see that this is a real mixture of black and white people coming into that store. I worked in that store. It was my first economic contact with the black population. They were the customers, they had the money. And essentially, I got my MBA in that store.
And speaking of family, that is me as an almost 3-year-old. Precocious, obviously. What you can't see there, maybe some of you can, I had a little spinning top. And that was my favorite toy of all time. I carried that spinning top with me everywhere. That's my father standing next to me. That's my middle brother standing behind me. And my oldest brother is the one who took the photograph. So those are the Sanford men in 1956. And it's just that picture, and I have it on my desk at home. It sort of helps me it reminds me of where I came from. And it reminds me of certainly the 3 people in my life, early in my life, who had the most impact on my life. My father and my 2 brothers. And if you can see way back in the back, you will see the quintessential outhouse. And it was functional, and we used it quite often.
One of the things that you notice as a Southerner, and both Otis and I are Southerners, is when you go north, your racial antenna is up. And one of the things that we've talked about a lot is race in the North. My first encounter with race in the North was going to Yale University in 1962, which was supposedly integrated. There were 5 African Americans in a class of 1,000. So again, there was a connection with the University of Mississippi because James Meredith entered the University of Mississippi at the same time. So I became the center of attention, more like a target. And that set me on a path of looking at, reading about, and researching racial history, economic history, and colonial nationalism for the rest of my life.
Oh, well, and my first encounter in the North, for any length of time, obviously, was when I moved to Pittsburgh. This was in the mid-1980s. I had spent pretty much all of my adult life in the South, growing up here in Mississippi. My first job out of college was working at the Clarion Ledger in Jackson. Then I went to Memphis and worked at the Commercial Appeal for 10 years. So I was in my early 30s when I decided to venture north. And I went to Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was a fascinating place. It is very, very parochial there. Everybody stays in their own little neighborhoods. Race was not that much of a, people deal with, you know, their ethnicity is a big issue in Pittsburgh. You know, there was a Polish community, there's, you know, African Americans, a very small percentage of the population. I didn't know that going in. But it was an eye-opening experience for me to live in Pittsburgh and to understand that culture for about 7 years.
Go back.
Oh, sorry.
So what we wanted to talk about was an area that Otis and I have talked about a lot, and that was really a pivotal era, the Reconstruction and how we got there, why it failed. I initially thought that it was a missed opportunity. This is the transition from slavery into freedom. And then Du Bois said it was a splendid failure. I thought it was still a failure. And now I think it's a charade. And one of the reasons is a very much ignored part of American history, which is white attitudes in the North towards black people. We know that the abolitionists were anti-slavery, but we don't know as much about their attitude towards black people. Generally, they were anti-black, and their great fear was a migration north of black people. So on the screen now is the words of Samuel R. Ward, a black abolitionist in the 1840s, who said white abolitionists best love the colored man at a distance. And here is, I'll go through this quickly, Connecticut did a census in 1800. Connecticut had already had gradual emancipation in 1784. But the census asked, was a black person different, born free or born enslaved, in terms of morality and in terms of industry? This is the president of Yale, Timothy Dwight, and he, as you can see, thought they were generally neither able nor inclined to make their freedom a blessing to themselves, and they were end up as victims of sloth, poverty, ignorance, and vice. Within 2 years, Connecticut had disenfranchised its black population, which was 2%. If you cannot live with a 2% population, what's going to happen when it gets to be larger? In addition, Connecticut started a colonization society to encourage blacks to move back to Africa. And I guarantee you that this is not taught in the Oregon school system. This is on the eve of the American Civil War, and it's the Oregon state constitution. There was an exclusion law. Now remember, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois had black exclusion laws. In abolitionist Massachusetts, when there were refugees, black refugees during the American Civil War who were behind Union lines, they didn't know what to do with them. They tried to send them to Massachusetts. The governor of Massachusetts, John Andrew, one of the heroes of the movie Glory, said, no, we don't want them. 2 years later, he wanted them, but mainly they were having problems in terms of draft. So they wanted to recruit these to be initiated into the draft to fight back south. Now, this is pretty explicit. No, okay.
Oh, sorry.
You want me to do this part? That's an exclusion law. Now, during the Civil War, did things change, and what was the attitude? And here we get into journalism. The New York Times, as we know, liberal progressive press today, but it said it wanted to get cotton back into production. And how do you do that? You do it with white ingenuity and black labor. Very, very explicit. And I won't go into the cotton story yet, but cotton was the determining factor economically for America and for black people for 150 years. First as enslaved people, and secondly as free laborers. And this next sentence, I think, is very instructive. The Negro race would exist side by side with the white for centuries, being constantly elevated by it, individuals of it rising to an equality with the superior race. But in the 1880s, the New York Times approved of the Supreme Court, which were all radical Republican judges, approved their neutering of the civil rights law. In the 1890s, the New York Times agreed with segregated school system, particularly in the Midwest. So you had journalism during this period following very, very closely a Southern path in terms of attitudes towards black people. Now, who won the Civil War? The North won the Civil War. Now, the South was in absolute shambles. So the North could have done anything that it wanted to. What was the first thing that the North did? It reduced its Union Army from 1 million soldiers to a few thousand by 1876. This is not a commitment. So in essence, the North was afraid of this black migration. And what they did was, it was expedient. They said, we'll pass laws to give blacks rights in the South so they won't move north. That was George Boutwell, radical Republican from the state of Massachusetts. The result was a containment policy. And by that, I mean between 1865 and 1914, the black migration north did not exist. The black population of the North stayed under 2%. Now, how did that happen when 18 million white immigrants came into this country? That only changed with a world war, which is an economic phenomena as well. So industry booms, unemployment goes from 8.5% to 1.5%, and no white immigration. So that's when that was the catalyst for the Great Migration north of black people. And what happened as soon as they got there were race riots. This is an example. The only attempted mass migration north during this period was from Vicksburg and the Deep South because of oppression and bad cotton crops. They were, because of a hyped real estate market, they were going to, and they were called exodusters, and they were going to Kansas. Kansas says, no, we don't want them. Now, this is an interesting document. It's unfortunately too small to see, but I think you'll know what I mean when I start talking about it. It is a 1910 calendar from the Bank of Mount Bio. So at this point, you have a separatist society, and in terms of economics, that never works. You cannot have a self-sufficient economic ethnic group. It has to be part of the mainstream. But blacks weren't allowed to enter that mainstream during this period. So what was happening here, these are the stepping stones: religion, industry, education, and all leading to power. It was the thought. Above that, there's a notation in terms of the black progress, and it mentioned 41 banks. Those 41 banks failed. There were over 100 banks, black banks during this period. And again, without entering the economic mainstream, the fluctuations in the economy and various other factors mean that you cannot have a separate economic society.
And one of those banks was started by Robert Church in Memphis, Tennessee, Solvent Bank. And it was one of those that did not last as well.
This is what happened after Reconstruction. And this is very critical, because what happened was, for 100 years in the North and the South, racial mores hardened. And for the North, that meant ghettos and race riots. And what this is a flyer from 1964 in New York, where black parents were very upset in terms of the inferior school system in New York for blacks and for Hispanics. 464,000 students boycotted the New York school system during this period. And this, of course, was one of the original race riots in America. This was in 1965 in Watts in Los Angeles. It occurred a week after the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1965. In 1964, Civil Rights Act 64, there were many race riots that had nothing to do with the Civil Rights Act. They were just endemic to the urban North. So they occurred in New York, Rochester, New York, Philadelphia, and several towns in New Jersey. What was interesting about the 64 situation in New York was that the mayor of New York, Robert Wagner, had his staff called Martin Luther King to bring him to New York to curb racial tensions. They called Martin Luther King. He was in Jackson, Mississippi. So in 1964, Martin Luther King was brought from Jackson, Mississippi to New York to quell a race riot, a fact that many people don't know. So what we want to do now is bring things to the present. And one of the things that was always interesting for me was this identity issue in terms of the black population. And there are two images on the screen. And one of my professors at Yale was a guy named Stoughton Lynn. He was the radical professor during the 1960s. He actually led, he was white, he led the education part of the Mississippi Freedom Summer. And before he moved to Yale in 1964, he taught at Spelman University, as you know, for black women in Atlanta. And in 1962, he started his survey course in American history with the Pilgrims and Plymouth Rock. The young women's hands go up and they say, what's that got to do with us? The next year, he started his course with the Olmsted Slave Revolt. The young women in that class, hands go up, and they said, why are you treating us differently? So there you have the tension in terms of identity within the black community. And one of the things, just to bring you up to date in terms of education and economics before we start talking about journalism, and there we have our star here, Otis Sanford. The difference in terms of what happened in the 1960s and now is dramatic. For example, economics. The black poverty rate stayed the same level in terms of ratio versus white, 3 times the level of the white poverty ratio during this period, 50 years. In terms of wealth accumulation, we know that African Americans have excelled in every aspect of American life, and we know that there's a middle class with a very fragile asset base, and an underclass. So in terms of wealth accumulation in the last 30 years, this is from Democratic to Republican administrations. The white figure went up 84%, which is 3 times that of the black population. Black ownership of homes stays pretty solid, 41%, white 79%. The income gap has remained very, very similar. What I consider a very, very important statistic, and I'm not going to talk about many more statistics, is the number of businesses owned by people with paid employees. And that figure for black is there are only 2% of businesses in the U.S. with paid employees today are owned by the black population. In terms of education, just a couple numbers. More than 56% of black high school students need remedial work. And in terms of let's take New York, for example. At this point in time, between 3rd and 8th grade level, those kids, black kids who are reading at grade level is about 30%. For math, it's about 25%. The expenditure, and people always talk about resources and money, the expenditure per capita in New York is $23,000 per capita in terms of students. What is happening with that money? So we get to the journalist part, and did you want to add anything?
Well, there was one point that you, when we were talking about, certainly at the turn of the century, I think it was Du Bois who indicated that African Americans going to college and the percentage of African Americans in college and the jobs that they got coming out of college generally were in education, right? generally in teaching, because that was considered to be the middle class job for African Americans early on. My mother was one. I mean, she was fortunate enough to go to college. She couldn't come here, but she went to Mississippi Industrial College over in Holly Springs. But she went to be a teacher. That was the pipeline for a middle class life. You agree with that?
Yeah, and that was the only avenue open to black people. The number in terms of teachers for the 2,000 people surveyed by Du Bois who did not have a computer, I have no idea how he did this, was 54%, and 70% became ministers. There were only 3% that were in business at this point. And look at what happened coming forward. And these are the Georgetown statistics in terms of college majors for black students. 40% of the students are majoring in community service or social work. In terms of the higher paying jobs, between 5 and 7%, it's finance, business, computer science, and engineering. So again, you get this very small number creating a small pipeline, even into the media area. And in healthcare, it's 20%, but most of that, 10 to 15%, is administrative work. It is not STEM. It is not big pharma. So you have almost a baked-in income gap in terms of college majors. So it's creating a pipeline that's small. And Otis has had plenty of experience in terms of hiring, both in his work in Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Memphis. And he can explain the issues involved in terms of hiring people in the media world.
Well, absolutely. You know, when you look at diversity in media, the starting point has to be post the riots that Gene was talking about, and you had the Kerner Commission. The Kerner Commission was an extensive study about what was going on with race in America, and certainly racial violence in America. One of the things that the Kerner Commission said was, when it comes to media, is that news organizations, the newspapers generally, but news organizations specifically, need to reflect the makeup of their community. Newspaper editors around the country saw that, they looked at it, and then they looked in their newsroom and they say, Lord, are we failing here? We have to do something about this. We have to start somewhere. So we have to go out and diversify our newsrooms. We need universities to grow more a minority journalism students, so we'll have someone to choose from. That started in the early 1970s. I came to this university in 1973, and I was not the only African American in the journalism program. We had several, and a lot of us got jobs coming out of this department. I was the first African American hired at the Clarion Ledger, first African American male hired at the Clarion Ledger in 1975. I was the second African American, though. My classmate, Linda Buford Burks, was hired a semester before me. We were the two African Americans in the newsroom. But then that started to grow. And again, the Kerner Commission was trying to, put a mirror up to us. And so that continued to progress. Major newspapers started aggressively hiring African Americans and promoting African Americans. Now, in 2018, that has pretty much gone by the wayside. Most newspapers, even the ones that can tout its hiring and certainly its racial diversity, I'm talking about places like Detroit, where I worked, which had outstanding numbers with diversity, Washington Post and New York Times, even they never reached the level that they were trying to reach. And certainly smaller communities in Memphis, we had great diversity in Memphis in the late 70s and 80s, but we never reached the percentage of the community. And so now with the retrenchment, when newspapers especially are downsizing and getting rid of staff, that has totally gone by the wayside. And when you look at the academic world where I am right now, it's kind of a sad commentary that in a place like Memphis, Tennessee, I am the only African-American journalism professor in our department. And it is a difficult thing when we are out recruiting and interviewing for faculty positions within our department, that the pipeline is just not strong enough to increase those numbers. It's kind of disheartening sometimes.
And this is what you're seeing on the other side of the table, interviewing applicants.
Absolutely it is.
Something similar happened in terms of the business world, which I learned when I wrote this book, which was that by the early 1960s, American corporations were aggressively trying to hire black people. And this was without government prompting. And again, the pipeline, which I've described, has been a big problem for major corporations for the last 50 years. One of the things that I wanted to ask Otis was, in terms of his role, could he describe his role as a journalist and as a black journalist? And is there tension? To what extent would there be tension in terms of this role? And also, does he feel a responsibility to do this? And how, given his position, does he avoid being pigeonholed as a race expert only?
That's a really good question. We have talked about this before.
Yeah.
The great thing about my career in journalism, and I'm now into 43 years in journalism. The great thing about my career is when I started out here at the university, it was never embedded into my brain that you need to think of yourself as a black journalist. You need to think about being a journalist. You go cover the news. I'm not going to send you to go cover what's going on at the Black Baptist Church. They sent me to cover Howard Baker coming to this campus in 1973. He was on the Watergate Committee at that time, and I covered the Howard Baker speaking here on this campus, and it was front page in the Daily Mississippian. I've always thought of myself as a journalist who is African American. All the jobs that I've had did not pigeonhole me as an expert in race relations or in African American life. I mean, yeah, I know about African American life because I've lived one, but I was never seen as that person to go to. I was seen as the person to go to find out what's going on in federal court, what's going on in politics in Memphis, what's going on at the police station in Jackson when I was down there. So that's been a blessing in my life, because now my book is about race, but it is about the evolution of politics in Memphis by both African Americans and the white community. So I've been fortunate that I have never been typecast in any racial role in any of my careers. Same thing in my academic life. You know, I have the chair of excellence in journalism at the university, which means I do a lot of other things in addition to teaching. I do a lot of stuff on the campus. I bring in a lot of special guests. I do a lot of stuff in the community. And it goes beyond race. But race is one of the things that I like to talk about, that I like to research and study, because it provides a fascinating insight into where we are, where we've been, and I think where we're headed.
And how have you dealt with the distinction between advocacy, because you're clearly aware of your own racial past,
right,
and the racial past of the country, and objectivity.
Yeah.
And here, it's not a question of, I mean, you've been on every side. You've been on the opinion side,
right,
you've been on the reporting side,
right,
and you've been on the editing side.
Exactly.
So there's subtle ways that you can influence things. For example, you can decide which articles are printed, which are important, and you can actually edit those articles.
Right.
So how do you deal with the advocacy, which you feel emotionally, and the objectivity?
Yeah, another good question. When I was an editor, let's start at the editing side. When I was an editor, it was an asset, I felt, to have my voice in the room because I came from a different perspective. And I wasn't the only African American voice in the room for most of that time, but I was probably the leading African American voice in the room. And I didn't bring my blacksmith into the room to say, let's push for this story, because it's a racial story that we have to have on the front page. I took my news judgment in the room, but that news judgment was based on my background, what I thought was important, what I thought all readers would want to know based on my knowledge of the entire readership. So I think that worked very effectively for me. Of course, when you're an African American journalist working for mainstream newspapers, African Americans in the community sometimes will expect you to go out of your way to promote African American causes. And to the extent that it did not compromise the product or did not compromise our news coverage, I did it because we are an inclusive organization. And we wanted to reflect the entire community. So absolutely I did that. And certainly as a reporter, I covered everybody fairly, and I think I covered everybody honestly. But when you talk about the advocacy, for the last 11 years of my journalism life, I have been an opinion journalist. I have written a lot about politics in Memphis. I've written a lot about race in Memphis from an opinion point of view. I write a column, and I do television commentary. And I look at things, a lot of people have accused me over the last several years of being this flaming liberal journalist in Memphis when, okay, so what? I'm really not. I'm probably left of center. But I do believe in fairness, and I will call things out, and I do believe that I try to speak for the underdog a lot. And if that makes a person left of center or more toward liberal, then so be it, because I believe in giving a voice to those who have no voice. But it is a tricky thing. And I have navigated all of that in my career, from being a reporter who covered the facts and wrote the story, from being an editor who sent people out on a story, to just coming up with stories that I thought the entire community wanted to know, and now being an opinion journalist that I get to tell you what I think and tell you where to go sometimes. And also now in the academic world, where I'm trying to teach the new generation of journalists how to do it in this high-tech world where the newspaper is much, much less important, but where journalism still is valued if you do it the right way.
Otis has been a journalist since he was 11 years old. And one of the things that he's very good at is asking tough questions. And I've been on the receiving end of a lot of those tough questions. When you look through a racial lens, you're going to see things differently. Before integration, particularly in the media, there were black papers. And what happens during an integrated and assimilated society is that virtually in every instance, whether it's newspaper, you had the Chicago Defender, which is my favorite because I'm from Mississippi, so I've done a lot of work in terms of the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh paper,
Pittsburgh, Courier,
the New Amsterdam paper,
right.
Baltimore. These are major papers. They are virtually non-existent now. The same thing would happen in terms of sports, where you had the historically black colleges and universities. When an athlete couldn't go to the University of Mississippi, would go to those places. They are no longer powerhouses. So there is going to be that part of identity which actually is either diminished or goes away when a society integrates. And in terms of the racial lens, one of the things that I uncovered in terms of the Chicago Defender were the headlines. They had a couple thousand stringers around the country, and they would always look at something from the black point of view because nobody else was looking at it from the black point of view. And it would even there was one headline I found in a Midwestern town, there was a tornado, and the huge headline was, tornado bypasses Negroes. There was nothing else about it. So, you know, when we look at a society now, what we're moving towards is a society that's value-oriented, not race-oriented. And in Otis's town, Memphis, there's an example, and I'd like to ask him a question about it.
Yeah.
The 9th district?
Yeah, the 9th Congressional District.
Congressional district is, the congressman is Stephen Cohen, who is very progressive. He votes with the Black Caucus 100% of the time, and yet and it's a majority black district, and yet the Black Caucus would not let him join the Black Caucus, even though he votes with them 100% of the time, and they try to defeat him every election. How do you stand on that?
Well, I mean, obviously, Steve Cohen has been in office now since he first got elected in 2006, so he's been there quite a while. And none of his elections have been close. He has run against African Americans, including King Willie. Willie Harrington, when he retired as mayor, came back to run against Cohen and was soundly defeated, even though people still love Willie Harrington in Memphis. They just didn't want him to be the congressman. They are very well satisfied with Steve Cohen because he does. He votes with the caucus. He has described himself as voting like an African-American woman. So that's who he is politically. He enjoys tremendous support in the city. He's running again this year, and I don't have any reason to believe that he won't win. Because people in Memphis, I don't want to say that they're post-racial when it comes to voting. Sometimes they are, a lot of times they are, because we have a white mayor in a predominantly African-American town and a white congressman. So you could say that we vote in a post-racial world. I'm not sure that that's going to last. But it's certainly the case right now, and I don't see it changing. Certainly, it's not going to change this year.
Should what should the attitude of the Black Caucus be?
I think that they should be inclusive. That's my opinion. The NAACP has white members. It hasn't changed its name. So I don't see any reason why the Black Caucus cannot have white members. I think that they should be inclusive and let him be a member. I think it's sort of narrow-minded.
Another thing that's happening here, actually it's mostly happening in the East, which I've noticed is in the Ivy League there are symbolic separate graduations for ethnic groups. In other words, the black student body has a separate symbolic graduation. The Hispanic group has a separate symbolic graduation. Mm-hmm. Your attitude towards that?
Yeah, I'm not a fan. It kind of, to me, it sort of harkens back to my senior year of high school, the first year of real integration in Mississippi, and I was a senior at North Panola High School in Sardis, and African Americans were the majority student population, so to guard against there being only a black queen of the homecoming or a black valedictorian, we decided let's just have one of each. So we had a white homecoming queen and a black homecoming queen, and we had a black king and a white king. We had a black valedictorian and a white valedictorian. I'm just not a fan. I believe that if we are one, we only need one. And so whoever the queen is, the queen is. And so I'm not, even in today's world where I see that that's happening some places, I'm just not a fan of that.
Both Otis and I have served as mentor, particularly for students and for people in work. And there is a feeling that a black person needs a black mentor, and I would be opposed to that. In an integrated world, there needs to be familiarity, and familiarity means an interaction among the races. And Otis has been mentor for many, many people, and your own mentor was who just passed away.
Who just passed away. A white editor who gave me 4 jobs in this business and pretty much helped to guide my career. And I will love him forever for doing that. But you are absolutely right. You know, I consider myself to be a mentor for a lot of kids, a lot of students at the University of Memphis. Most of them are white. But a lot, you know, we have a very, you know, high, our diversity is very strong at the at Memphis. I think about 40% of our population is African American. So I have a lot of African American students as well. But when it comes to mentoring, I probably mentor more white kids than I do African Americans.
There's, in the book, there's a friend of mine is a minister in Mississippi, a black minister named Reverend Edward Thomas. And I once asked him, I said, does it make any difference if I speak to a black kid or you do? And he said, Gene, there are things you can tell him that I can't, and there are things that I can tell him that you can't.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
And one of the transformative experiences of my life is being a majority, a very, very small majority in another country, and that was Japan. Very successful, big, prosperous society, and yet it is the most, probably the most segregated society in the world. It is homogeneous, it is hierarchical, it is cohesive, it is successful, it has strengths and weaknesses. And I was there to observe for 9 years what a homogeneous society was like. And it was polar opposite from America, which is the only grand experiment in a multi-ethnic society. And I came back saying that the only real society has to have multi-ethnic cultures involved and major concessions to assimilation, particularly in terms of the financial area. And the focus of this book that I've written is how to get a broad mass of black Americans into the economic mainstream.
Before we open it up to questions, let me ask you a question. Going back to your childhood, can you briefly talk about your relationship with African American kids in your community outside the store? What was your interaction and relationship?
It's very, very traditional. There were friendships. We played with African American kids until 12, 13, 14 puberty. So it's that ended at that point. And so the next episode of my life I thought was going to be at Yale University. It didn't happen. The only black person that I was well acquainted with was Jamaican. He wasn't an African American. So my experience and what concerns me a lot today is with a segregated school system, de facto in the North and the South. Whether if you want the numbers in New York or San Francisco, I'll give them to you. But they're pretty much segregated. So the first place where there's real interaction, particularly between blacks and whites, is at the university level, and that's in the classroom. It's in the social level. So what disturbs me is the acquiescence to group identity. And the Hillel, which is the Jewish organization, is fine, but it shouldn't be the center of a student's life. The Black Student Union is absolutely fine. It shouldn't be the center of a student's life. The classroom is the perfect place to hash out ideas and to look at different perspectives. I'm always about different perspectives. And in that context, I adhere to, and Otis as well, there are universal standards. It doesn't break down by race. And those universal standards are civility and respect and listening and questioning and a knowledge base.
Absolutely. You know, Gene and I do want to open up for questions. Gene and I live parallel lives. He in the Delta, I'm in Panola County. But it was because of those qualities that we came together. And we have become friends as a result of it, because we share sort of a common background. Living in Mississippi, we share common interests because we like to talk about race, and we share common goals because we're both authors. It just proved positive that even in Mississippi, anything can happen.
The last time.
Yeah.
Before we open the question, I mentioned familiarity, which is very, very important to me. It's exposure to other people. And this is an image. At my 50th reunion in college, I went to the unconscious bias presentation, and there was a psychologist there who was going through a lot of graphs and a lot of different professions in terms of unconscious bias and the lack of trust. And there were these small gradations in these graphs. So finally, I raised my hand when he got to the white doctor and the black patient. And I said, was this the first visit? And he said, yes. And then he started again with multiple graphs. And I said, excuse me, sir, what happened after subsequent visits? And he said, oh, the lack of trust dissipated. And I think we'll leave it at that and open it up for questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Questions?
Can you comment on what you expect the racial climate will be in, say, 2050 here in Mississippi?
Oh, wow.
The Brookings Institute predicts that we'll be majority in 2045, with black folks being less than 50%. So,
Right.
with that being the case in Mississippi, what do you all forecast for this state?
Wow, that is a really tough question, because as much as I love my home state, Mississippi has always struggled with conformity, and so I still see a lot of tension there. A lot of it depends on the politics and who's politically in control and what kind of mindset those folks will have 20, 30 years from now. It's hard to say because I honestly believe that that's one of the great fears that drives our political discourse today, is the fact that a majority, not just state, but a minority nation is what's driving a lot of the tension and concern right now. So I'm not all that hopeful that there will be widespread harmony by 2050.
Yeah, I agree with Otis. It would be very difficult at this point in time to be optimistic about that. I think we have, in a multi-ethnic nation, you have two choices. You basically break into separate groups, which is what is happening today, or you deal with values rather than race. So the fact that there's a minority population, to me, is not significant if the value system is the same.
Right.
So it's, by 2050, if we're still in a group situation, we will have, as a government, an autocracy. It will always happen because that's the only way to rule. It'll be the Ottoman Empire. And I don't see any difference. I don't see any difference between Mississippi and New York. New York is a blue state, blue city. Residential segregation exists both in the school system, as I said, and as well as the residents. New York is a diverse group of segregated sections. And when you look at even San Francisco, Chicago, Detroit, this has got to change. And I think the answer, and coming back to my own interest in economics, is an economic structure that allows movement into the economic mainstream, where people have a stake in the society. That has to be done not in the government sector. It has to be done in the private sector. And there has to be, particularly within the black community, which has been denied, this accessibility for a long time. There has to be a commercial mindset that wants to generate this move.
Yes, I have many questions. Narrowed it down.
I think we're going to
All right, because y'all covered a lot of stuff. Appreciate it. And two questions. Whenever the conversation is on race, it's narrowed down to two groups, African, European, as if no other groups exist. I wonder why that is. Second question is, notice both of you use the term African American. Now, coming out of MI College, it's my understanding that American is citizenship. And citizenship carries with it legal status. So when did the African become an American? When did that happen?
Well, first of all, in terms of other nationalities and other ethnic groups, I've spent 11 years in Asia, and one of the things that we have as the unity of the people of color, I think is fallacious because essentially all of these societies are very, very different in terms of cultural aspects. Koreans versus Japanese versus Chinese. They all have their different cultures. So yes, of course. I lived in Japan in the 1980s. It was the first time a non-white, non-Western nation had challenged America economically. Japan is a very, very important segment. Now, of course, we have China. These are competing entities. If anyone thinks of the global world as harmony is wrong. There's going to be vicious competition. We have to be ready for it. A Japanese does not look at race in America. They look at everybody as an American, and they will brutally and viciously, this sounds like a spiel for nationalism, but we have to be ready for that competition in terms of what's going on abroad, particularly from Asia.
And as far as African American and non-African American, I'll just say this. I use the term because I'm recognizing my heritage and my citizenship. And that's why I use it. I don't know why anybody else would.
That was my question. When did Africa gain legal citizenship?
Well, I mean, the American part of it is my citizenship. The African part of it is my heritage because I know where my heritage comes from. Okay. Yes.
I guess what is your take on biracial? Does someone have to choose? Because in my personal case, I'm half Filipino and I'm half American.
Mm-hmm.
But whenever I'm in Asia, I'm too American white to be Filipino, and then whenever I'm here, I'm too Asian to be white. Like,
Right.
so I just wondered, like, do people have to choose? I don't know.
No, at this stage, there are many parts of you in terms of an identity. There's the Asian part, there's the American part, and you don't have to choose.
Right.
And I deal a lot of conversations with that in terms of particularly Asians because I've been in Asia for so long. There are a lot of parts of you. You don't have to choose.
Right. And I've had students in my class who have written about that in a very eloquent way. And they basically said the same thing. I don't want to have to choose. I'm all of it. And they resent having to be typecasted or having to check some box that they don't want to have to check. Right.
But it doesn't even have to be biracial. There was a Thai student who I had a lot of conversations with, and the minute in college that she worked in Thailand, she knew she didn't fit there. So she's in San Francisco with a good job, and yet she has a heritage that's in Thailand that she's close to. And this is not a contradiction. It's actually a beauty that you can fuse these identities.
I don't know if you happen to hear the group heard on NPR this morning when I was listening. They were doing a piece on Ernest Withers, the photographer, who
Right.
famously we all know the picture of him with the trash collectors.
Right. Right. I am a man picture.
I am a man picture. And one of the interesting things he was saying, he always
Right. I knew him quite well. As a matter of fact, I visited him just the day before he died. We had a good relationship. Yes, the book that's out right now, that's written by one of my former colleagues, Mark Pereskia, Spy in Canaan, it's a detailed book about how he absolutely provided information to the FBI. It's coming from a series of stories that Mark did a few years ago when I was still at the paper. I think from Withers' point of view here is that he was always this freelance journalist, freelance in every way. He was free to work for anyone. He was not tied to one single newspaper. And so that gave him carte blanche to do whatever he wanted to do to try to earn some money. I do believe that he felt that he wasn't doing anything that caused personal harm to anybody, but he wanted to be paid for what he was doing. And because he saw other people getting paid or other people getting money, and I think he was underpaid for the valuable photographs that he took for many, many years, including Emmett Till and going all the way through Little Rock and the Memphis in '68 and even beyond that. He never got the financial benefit that I think he richly deserved. And I know he felt that way. So he felt that whatever he did that got him a little bit of money, even if it was from the FBI, as long as it wasn't hurting anybody, he didn't see any harm in doing it. We will debate now about whether he is a sellout, a traitor, or whatever. And that's for the history and current readers of the book to decide. And we'll just have to let them decide that. But it's a fascinating piece of history about an unbelievably talented and courageous man who went everywhere, including here on this at this university in '62 with the integration with James Merritt.
Do you think that he should be judged by present standards or the standards of that age? And that was the 1960s. That's not today.
Right. Well, I mean, I think he should be judged by, I don't think he should be judged by the ethical standards that I would judge journalists who are tied to specific journalism organizations. He was a freelancer. He was doing things on his own. So no, I don't think that he should be judged by the standards that I would judge myself. I would never have done that. But I wasn't Ernest Withers, and so I can't make that judgment for him. Yes, so here. Yeah.
Well, race has long been kind of discredited as a biological thing, yet race continues to hold this power to separate.
Yeah.
It's not going to, that power isn't going to go away by pretending it doesn't exist. How do we take away that power to separate?
Wow.
You want the question again?
Race has long been discredited as a biological category, I think, but race continues to hold this power to separate. And why is that? Why is that power? I mean, and pretending that it doesn't exist isn't going to increase that power.
Right.
But how do we decrease that power? Makes sense.
One of the things, as I said, is the interaction and the familiarity. And to understand there are things that we have in common. And particularly, listen, Martin Luther King, he was very attached to Western civilization. When Alex Haley in 1965 interviewed him for Playboy magazine, he said, "What is your second favorite book after the Bible?" And King said, "Plato's Republic." And then I went through King's speeches and looked at his references in terms of Western civilization. Shakespeare, Edgar Allan Poe, the Latin poet Ovid, who else was, St. Augustine. So there is a common denominator. And one of the things in terms of our history that needs to be done is our common basis in terms of politics is the Federalist Papers. So we have to understand that as a nation, we have to understand that history as opposed to breaking down in terms of ethnic and racial groups.
And I will say in terms of when do we get to the point where it's no longer dividing, creates division and separation. I think we get there when, again, familiarity helps with that, but I think we get there when African Americans are no longer made to be defensive, or actually when white Americans are no longer made to be defensive, and African Americans are no longer pointing fingers. And we're not there yet because there's a lot of defense mechanisms that build up when we start to talk about race. I had a guy this morning who sent me an email because he's just tired of all of the MLK 50 articles in the paper. Well, I don't even work for the paper anymore, and I still get this stuff. And he's just tired of it. When is it going to end? And I'm trying to help him to understand this is a history lesson here. There are a lot of people who have no idea about what happened in 1968. I teach a lot of them. And so we're educating as we commemorate here. And he just didn't understand that because he felt like, I'm just tired of having to be defensive about all of this. So when we get past that, when we get past the defensiveness, I think that's when we stop making race a division and separation and really something that we can come together on.
And also, I think rather than looking at every 50 years or an anniversary, we need to just say, look at Martin Luther King as a complex individual. And not only that, but look at him in relation to the other giants of American history, of black history particularly, and compare them, Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, to understand this is not a monolithic group. This is a group where there are enormous rivalries and enormous differences of opinion. And it's fascinating to me, it's been fascinating to me for the last 50 years.
And I would say, look at him as one of the great orators and great Americans of our time, no matter what race he is. I mean, he is one of the greatest orators in history. We just unveiled one of his speeches at the university Monday. I mean, the man was brilliant when it came to writing and delivering oratory. He was just one of the greatest orators of our time. You had a question?
You said earlier, talking about bringing this into the classroom, particularly whether it's high school or college, but particularly, I guess it doesn't matter whether you're in the South or the North, but that your exposure to other racial identities doesn't come until college. Well, that excludes, 70% of the population from having that exposure at some point, I guess. But in the college classroom, you have these new exposures. How do you deal with them civilly, with respect and attitude toward listening? What are some ways in which you, either in the college classroom or in other contexts, how do you navigate some of these conversations?
I think, by example, first of all, and the topics that you pick, they don't have to be about race. And we didn't read a manual on race communication. We didn't have a facilitator. We don't need a conflict resolution person. Let me give you an example. One of the topics that in American history could be take the black point of view and the white point of view towards Abraham Lincoln. Put Abraham Lincoln on trial, and you can see the differences of opinion of Lincoln, the emancipator, Lincoln, the person who held this country together. Without him, there would be no country, and yet, even had Lincoln lived, he could not have stopped what happened in terms of Reconstruction or afterwards. So that's the kind of topic that you can diffuse the sensitivities and come to grips with an intellectual grasp of the subject matter. Last question.
In terms of like humility, but
Familiarity?
yes, it's such a tough topic.
It is.
Anyway, in terms of that, for instance, I've gone to 13 different schools in my life, and I have lived in 4 different states, but all in the South. And what I've recognized is that it's not even like I've gone to school with Asians, Indians, like I've gone to very diverse schools, but it hasn't been a matter of
Well, first of all, to the last part, I don't think we're ever going to totally get away from the conversation about race. I just don't think so. This country is not nearly ready to do that. Were you talking about introducing a lot of these issues in the secondary school system before people get to college? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, as long as we continue to have segregated schools like we do have, both north and south, that's going to be a very difficult thing. That's going to be up to people who run school boards and people who are in charge of education at state levels to try to do something about that. We tried to do that back in the 1960s and 70s, and we fought about it. I've told the story to Gene before. When in my senior year of high school, the first year of integration in Mississippi, we had to have a school meeting, bring the parents in, black parents, white parents, and have 4 kids, 2 black, 2 white, to get up and talk to the parents to tell them it's going to be all right. And I was one of those 4, to get up and make a speech to face the white parents in this community, North Panola, and tell them it's going to be all right for your kids to go to school with me. I thought it was demoralizing, but I did it because, well, first of all, I like to speak, so I got up and did it. But I think that's where universities, even things that don't happen in grade school and high school, universities are the place for it. Because that's where you get your best learning, is at the university level. And I understand that that means we're going to miss out on a lot of people. I agree with that. But the ones that we get, the group that's here, the groups that I teach, we have to face these issues. And I think we do it quite well at the university level. I think that's the only answer.
And also, to show how important this is, when you look at large, successful societies, prosperous societies, we are the only country that's making this grand experiment. So I wouldn't denigrate America. Europe is way, way behind. It's not going to work there. Asia, very successful economies. Korea, Japan, the opposite. They didn't even want to try it. There's no dual citizenship.
Right.
There's no immigration in Japan. So this is a country. Name one other than Europe doesn't try it. Asia doesn't try it. America. You can even the small country that is very successful is Singapore, multi-ethnic, Malay, mostly Chinese, and Tamil. There, in 1965, the autocratic ruler, benign autocrat, Lee Kuan Yew said, English has to be the mother tongue. It is not, that's the only way to survive. So you get the alternative to what we have is reducing rights and an autocratic leadership. So this is an experiment that everybody in this room is engaged in, and we have to make it successful.
Right.
Thank you.
Curtis? All right.